At precisely 8 a.m., Arthur's Somnovision Model 7 calculator stopped performing basic arithmetic and began displaying the exact time of future events down to the millisecond. If he typed 2 plus 2, the heavy plastic keys yielded a flashing green 12.4417. Arthur, an accountant rigidly devoted to logical constants, stared at the archaic 1980s hardware in mounting disbelief. The device refused to power down or reset, its LCD screen pulsing like a stubborn digital heartbeat in the silent, fluorescent-lit room.
Arthur tapped the heavy plastic keys again, his frustration mounting, as the green digits shifted to 08.0215. Exactly 3 seconds later, the overhead fluorescent bulb directly above his desk violently shattered, showering his ledger in sparks and fine glass. The machine wasn't broken. It was establishing a baseline of predictive accuracy. He stared at the newly formed 12.4417 on the screen, a cold dread pooling in his stomach as the implications of the shattered bulb settled over him. The digits waited.
Desperate to rationalize the event as a localized power surge, Arthur tried to unplug the heavy beige unit from the wall. The moment his fingers brushed the thick power cord, a sharp static shock arced up his arm, leaving a faint smell of ozone in the sterile air. The calculator's LCD screen pulsed brighter, casting an unnatural, sickly green hue across his trembling hands. The ambient temperature around his cubicle plummeted by 10 degrees, frosting the rim of his lukewarm coffee mug as the countdown held steady.
But as the gray morning dragged on into afternoon, his eyes kept drifting back to the unblinking screen, and then up to the cheap analog clock ticking on the peeling plaster wall. It was exactly 12:15 p.m., and the calculator still read 12.4417, the decimal point flashing with a rhythmic, hypnotic precision. The fragile rationalization began to crumble as a cold, creeping logic took over his exhausted, analytical mind. This device, a relic of Somnovision systems, was not malfunctioning. It was operating on a set of physics that had simply bypassed the local reality. The machine always told the absolute truth, but human minds consistently failed to comprehend its cold, numerical parameters until it was too late.
Time ticked forward. At 12:30 p.m., Arthur stood up abruptly, a horrifying realization crystallizing in his analytical mind. He looked down at the sequence 12.4417. It wasn't a random error. It was a highly specific GPS coordinate. Driven by a sudden, obsessive need for absolute certainty, he grabbed his coat and rushed to his car, desperate to prove the machine wrong by locating the physical space it pointed to. He drove for an hour, following a paper map until he reached the outskirts of a forgotten municipal cemetery. Following the exact coordinates, he stumbled through the overgrown grass until he stopped dead in his tracks. There, at the precise location of 12.4417, was a freshly dug open grave. Standing at the head of the dark, rectangular hole was a pristine granite headstone clearly engraved with his own full name. The date of death listed was tomorrow.
A primal, suffocating panic gripped his chest. The calculator hadn't generated a location. It had delivered an absolute, unchangeable prophecy. Arthur scrambled back to his car, his mind racing with frantic plans to alter a timeline dictated by a plastic machine. He sped back to the perceived safety of his windowless office, convinced that if he just locked himself in the concrete room, he could somehow outwit the parameters of his own mortality. 12:44.
At exactly 12:44:17 the next day, a commercial logging truck lost its air brakes on the adjacent elevated highway, its massive tires screaming against the asphalt. The colossal vehicle careened through the perimeter fence, launching off the embankment and slamming directly into the exterior wall of Arthur's second-story office. The impact was deafening. A catastrophic collision of tearing steel and pulverized concrete that instantly obliterated the entire room. The true, inexplicable horror of the event revealed itself as the heavy dust slowly began to settle. The truck's massive grille was embedded deep into the floor, having crushed the filing cabinets into flat metal ribbons. Yet, Arthur's desk chair remained completely untouched by the carnage, sitting perfectly upright in the exact center of the devastation, entirely devoid of its occupant. He was simply gone. The display remained completely unchanged. The green digits 12.4417 held perfectly still, burning steadily as the heavy dust continued to settle over the empty office chair.
Dust settled silently. Amidst the twisted rebar and shattered concrete, resting on the only surviving corner of the wooden desk, the Somnovision Model 7 calculator sat completely undamaged. The CCTV camera captured the device's screen flickering back to life. It no longer displayed Arthur's time of death. Instead, glowing in the cold, dusty light, the green screen simply read 34.
Case File 816. A 62-year-old teacher uses a vintage 1983 Somnovision slide projector on his last day before retirement, only to find slide 1 showing his very first class from decades ago. Unsettlingly, he is sitting among the children in the photograph, looking exactly as old as he does today. The heavy dust motes dance in the harsh beam of light as he taps the heavy metal casing, expecting the impossible image to correct itself. Instead, the machine clicks forward automatically to display slide 2 on the pull-down screen. It shows the exact same 1983 classroom, but now all the children's chairs are completely empty. Muttering about double exposures and degraded film stock, he turns around to face his current students, fully expecting to see them snickering at an elaborate prank.
Absolute, dead silence. He stares at the 24 empty desks, the sudden absence of 24 breathing teenagers, leaving a vacuum in the cold air. A logical explanation immediately forms in his mind. A silent fire drill he somehow missed, or a staged walkout for his retirement. He steps toward the hallway door, his brown tweed jacket rustling against the eerie stillness of the room. The hallway outside is perfectly empty, bathed in the same flickering fluorescent light as the classroom. He calls out, but his voice simply dies in the corridor without producing a single echo.
Behind him, the Somnovision projector clicks again, the mechanical sound unnaturally loud in the dead space. Slide 3 is a real-time photograph of his current classroom right now, showing him standing by the open door. The angle is impossible, taken from the ceiling corner, exactly where the CCTV security camera is mounted. Panic begins to thread through his rationalizations as he rushes back to the desk to shut the machine down. He grabs the thick black power cord and yanks it directly from the wall socket. Still blindingly bright.
The projector clicked to the final slide, an exterior shot of the school building, completely abandoned and boarded up. But the projection didn't stay on the screen.
The moment the image came into focus, the physical reality of the classroom instantly snapped to match it. The painted cinder blocks instantaneously rotted into decaying wood. The bright fluorescent lights died, and a thick layer of decades-old dust settled over the empty desks in a fraction of a second.
He stumbled backward, his hands grasping for the door handle. It was heavily padlocked from the outside, covered in deep orange rust. There were no spatial anomalies, no shifting geometries, just the brutal, terrifying reality that he was now trapped inside the abandoned version of the school from the photograph. He pounded his fists against the rotting wood, his screams muffled by the dense, suffocating silence of a building that had been dead for 40 years.
He peered through a crack in the boarded-up window, desperate for a glimpse of the outside world. But there was no outside world. Beyond the splintered wood, there was only an endless, impenetrable void of static, like the blank space between slides on a carousel. The projector hadn't just shown him a picture of a dead school. It had physically excised this single room from the flow of time and permanently mounted it into the machine's internal carousel. It clicked faster. He was trapped. The air grew stale, heavy with the smell of mildew and old paper. The only source of light was the dim, ambient glow of the static pressing against the windows. He slumped against the rusted radiator, realizing the horrific truth of the Somnovision hardware. It didn't predict the future or alter the past. It simply locked whatever it photographed into an eternal, unchangeable stasis. He was now just another slide. The visual feed stabilized into a frozen, heavily degraded loop of the rotting classroom. The Somnovision projector sat on the desk, unplugged and completely dark. There was no sign of the teacher, the students, or the vibrant school that had existed moments before. The room was simply a quiet, forgotten space, waiting for a class that would never arrive.
The official police report noted a mass disappearance of 25 individuals during a routine Tuesday morning class. However, municipal zoning records painted a deeply contradictory picture of the incident location. The high school building, where the CCTV footage was recorded, was officially condemned and boarded up in 1984. The timestamp on the recovered Somnovision server drive reads today's date.
Archive File 412. Status: active. The following documentation details a localized auditorial anomaly within an urban museum. All data has been verified by internal analysts. At 3:14 a.m., a disconnected 1923 prototype Somnovision rotary telephone began to ring inside an empty museum exhibit. Night guard Tony, a 40-year-old male, answered the severed receiver and heard his own voice whisper a single command: "Do not turn around." He stood completely frozen in that exact posture for the next 10 hours, terrified of triggering whatever stood behind him. He didn't move a single muscle, perfectly obeying the impossible voice on the other end of the line. Archive 13 immediately deployed Protocol Fog to feed the local precinct a fabricated narrative of a severe, unprecedented stroke induced by a novelty replica. The responding officers blindly accepted this, completely ignoring the fact that the phone possessed no internal wiring, no power source, and no physical connection to any telecommunications network. The exhibit was originally sponsored by the defunct Somnovision Systems, showcasing early communication hardware in a repurposed 1980s shopping mall.
Our operatives ensured the police failed to comprehend that the ringing sound had never actually traveled through the air.
Measurable, heavy silence. Independent acoustic sweeps deployed around the frozen figure revealed a terrifying localized anomaly. The audio logs confirmed that the frequency was generating directly inside the spatial coordinates of the guard's auditory cortex, bypassing the eardrums entirely. The disconnected Somnovision phone was merely a focal point, a physical prop anchoring a non-physical intrusion into our reality. The frequency was measured at exactly 13.08 hertz, a vibration that seemed to absorb ambient noise rather than reflect it.
Degradation of the visual sensors began shortly after a hazmat technician, identified as Miller, attempted to physically move the polymerized guard. The CCTV feeds shifted into a harsh, distorted thermal gradient, struggling to process a sudden, massive ambient temperature drop. Miller reported a severe migraine and a sensation of intense, crushing pressure behind his eyes. Thermal scans of the frozen guard revealed that his internal organs had also converted to solid polymer, yet they were now arranged in impossible, overlapping geometric patterns. Total sensor failure.
At exactly 3:14 a.m. the following night, the severed phone rang a second time. Technician Miller, standing adjacent to the exhibit, was captured on body cam reacting to a deafening sound that did not exist on the raw audio tracks. Driven by an unseen compulsion, he reached out with trembling hands and lifted the second receiver from the dual-line Somnovision prototype. The digital artifacting on the video feed spiked immediately, masking his face in a mosaic of dead pixels as the frequency took hold.
Miller listened for exactly 4 seconds before his posture locked into a completely rigid, statuesque state. External monitors recorded his heart rate plummeting to a steady, impossible 4 beats per minute. The audio logs indicated that the voice he heard was his own, repeating an unknown sequence of numbers. Beyond that, the microphones recorded nothing but a dense, suffocating silence where ambient sound should have been. Light was swallowed. Then came the impossible moment that forced a complete quarantine of the sector. The severed cord of the Somnovision telephone began to elongate, stretching straight downward and sinking directly through the solid concrete floor without breaking the surface. It stretched infinitely downward, creating a perfect, impossible vertical line into the dark earth below. The visual feeds degraded into a storm of electromagnetic interference and harsh, high-contrast static. Through the corruption, the polymerized mannequin of the night guard exhibited a singular, terrifying anomaly. Without moving its rigid, synthetic jaw, the mannequin began to vocalize, broadcasting a looping, monotone frequency directly into the headsets of the remote monitoring team. The sound was not a voice, but a dense physical pressure that pushed violently against the inside of their skulls. When morning arrived, the museum staff found Tony standing in the exact same spot. He hadn't turned around, not once. But he was no longer breathing. His body had completely stiffened, his skin turning into a cold, hard wax. He had been transformed into a perfect, motionless mannequin, forever frozen in the uniform of a security guard, still clutching the severed receiver to his ear. He was now just another exhibit. The true horror was realized a week later. The anomaly didn't stop with Tony. Every person who answered the disconnected phone heard their own voice, stood frozen in terror, and eventually hardened into an identical, lifeless mannequin. The museum's storage room quickly filled with these perfect replicas.
The remaining staff walk the halls in quiet dread, completely unable to determine which exhibits were always wax and which ones used to be human. Somnovision devices were never designed to compute information. They computed reality itself.